Peter Dutton, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
So you've blamed the government for this inflation problem because they've been, as you say, spending like drunken sailors. So would you cut spending?
Well, David, just to put it into perspective, the government spent an extra $347 billion and don't take my word for it in terms of the impact. The Reserve Bank governor has been very clear that it has fuelled inflation. She's referred to homegrown inflation, and as we know in the US, the UK, New Zealand and Canada, interest rates have already come down, and there is a lot of work still to do in the economy here. I want to see interest rates come down as quickly as possible because Labor's cost of living crisis is really hurting families and small businesses, and we do want to see inflation dealt with. We want to see interest rates come down, and the Reserve Bank governor ultimately will make the decisions that she sees according to the economic settings that are relevant to her decision. But there's a long way to go before the government can start claiming that families are much better off.
Sure. Look, to be clear, the Reserve Bank governor did also say public demand's not the main game. But back to the question, would you cut spending?
Well, where we see wasteful spending, yes, we would. And putting an additional 36,000 public servants into Canberra at a cost of over $6 billion a year recurring expenditure, which is exactly the formula that Stephen Miles and Anastasia Palaszczuk had in Queensland and that Daniel Andrews and Jacinta Allen have adopted in Victoria. It sent those two economies through the floor, and it's a recipe to try and please the unions, not to try and drive government efficiency. So where there's inefficiency, yes, we supported the government in changes that they made to the NDIS because they acknowledged that there was money there that wasn't being appropriately spent, and we supported those changes through the Senate, which has made it a more sustainable scheme for those who are most in need.
Look, I guess every opposition does talk about cutting waste, finding more efficiencies. Fair enough, that has to be done. But the question is whether total spending, government spending, needs to be lower to get inflation down further.
Well, look, our desire is to manage the economy successfully, as my predecessors in John Howard, for example, did. When John Howard came into government, there was a mess to clean up. After the Hawke-Keating years, he cleaned it up and managed the economy successfully. And that's exactly the formula that I want to apply. I want to make sure that we can provide further support. We've announced further support for training places for doctors, for Medicare services around mental health, etc. So the frontline services we want to bolster, and we want to make sure that that is being delivered because people are hurting. And the band-aid fixes the government's got at the moment with energy relief. The fact is people's power bills have gone up by $1,000. Food's up by 12%. Electricity's up by 32%. Rents are up by 17%. So if the government's pretending that somehow they've performed this miracle, the economy's turned around and families should be grateful, I just don't think that's the discussion around family tables at the moment.
No, but this is a question about what you would do to fix all these problems. So again, would you actually lower spending, or is your approach to the economy not necessarily to lower spending?
Well, if we find wasteful spending, our intent is to cut it, and that will result in obviously an overall reduction in government expenditure. And if you're saving $24 billion plus over the forward estimates with the public servants, that's money that you can either use to pay off debt or you can use to put downward pressure on inflation. And that's how we help people. There are 27,000 small businesses who have closed in the last 2.5 years. Tell them that everything's going well.
Well, that's interesting. So you will save $24 billion by cutting all of those additional public servants in Veterans Affairs, in Defence and NDIA and so on.
There are 36,000 additional places that are being put on. I made the point in my speech on Friday that we protect frontline positions, but we're not going to allow the public service to balloon. It's exactly what happened in the Rudd-Gillard period, although I might say by not as much. It has dramatically increased under the Albanese government. And again, it's to please the unions. It's not to provide a more efficient delivery of services. I don't think any Australian can say that their lives are easier in terms of their interactions with government agencies because of 36,000 new public servants being employed in Canberra.
Well, there might be some veterans who are happy to see the backlog cleared and get their pension, but just again, are you going to cut all of those 36,000 public servants?
We are going to. We've said, David, and we've been very clear. We are not going to have the public service sitting at over 200,000 on Labor's projections. It wasn't that in the Rudd-Gillard years, and it's obvious that there's a correlation between a bloated service and a lack of productivity. The other aspect too, I might say, is that you're drawing people from the most productive parts of the economy to put them into lesser productive parts of the economy, and that is not helping our productivity problem at the moment. It's exacerbating it, and Labor just can't manage money. They can't manage the economy, and that's exactly why families are in the problem that they're in at the moment.
Would you have a spending audit like Tony Abbott did when he came in, the Tony Shepherd audit?
We're not having a similar style audit, but many of us have sat around the Expenditure Review Committee. I was Assistant Treasurer to Peter Costello many years ago. We know what we're doing. We're able to hit the ground running, and we've worked with the departments, with many of the departmental heads that are there now, and I have no doubt that we'll be able to find where Labor has put fat into the system that is not helping do anything but drive inflation. And I want to bring inflation down, because it's not just mortgage rates, as I say, it's every time people turn up to pay their grocery bill. They're taking items out of the basket, out of the trolley at the moment, and not putting them through the scanner because they can't afford their power. They can't afford their grocery bills or their power bills or their insurance bills under this government.
So not an independent audit, but you do your own. You'd run the ruler over all the spending yourselves. So we may not know until after the election where you'd cut.
We need to sit down and look through an ERC process, which would be the normal course of things. We'll do that in government. But as we know, Labor can't help but tax and spend, and that's why they're seeking to tax an unrealised capital gain in superannuation.
What about a further round of energy bill relief, if that's announced before the election? Would you support that or oppose it?
Well, David, the question is, and the threshold for us is it inflationary? So, as was pointed out before in the interview that you had, or the clip of that interview, there has been a temporary relief because of the band-aid fix that the government put in place. If it's fuelled inflation and it's just kept people's mortgage rates higher for longer, then that becomes counterproductive. Because, as I say, you can promise $275 reduction for a period before the election, then never mention it again. But people's electricity bills are up by $1,000, and we need to have some longer-term relief as well as the short-term relief, and so we'll judge it by that criteria.
Well, what do you think, though, of the previous rounds?
Well, inflation stayed high. That's the reality. Core inflation is still a problem, and if it wasn't, interest rates would have come down by now. And as I say, in comparable jurisdictions, in comparable economies, they have come down. That's the big difference.
But underlying inflation, core inflation, has come down.
Well, core inflation's come down. That's a good thing, but it hasn't come down to within the target range, and that's why interest rates have stayed higher for longer because of Labor's spending. So,
look, under your energy plans, would power bills over the next decade, before we get the first nuclear plant online, over the next 10 years, would power bills be lower?
Well, there are 2 points to make here. Access Economics did a lot of work and were a great organisation in their day, but Frontier Economics, I think, is the most preeminent body today in terms of energy modelling. They look at our energy policy compared to Labor's. They judge that it's 44% cheaper than Labor's policy. Importantly, Frontier do a lot of work for Labor in government, and they've done it for South Australia, they've done it for the federal government. Since that report has been released, the Treasurer, the Energy Minister, the Prime Minister have not punched any holes in the assumptions or the conclusions drawn from that report. So that's the independent analysis in terms of what the price impact will be. Between now and when our policy rolls out, there are 2 points to make. One is that we're not overbuilding the system like Labor is. So the 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires, which cost tens and tens of billions of dollars, are not required under our model. That is being felt in and priced into power bills today and over the next decade. And secondly, we have a lot to do in the short term, I think particularly in relation to gas and peaking, to provide support. State governments are signing up to an extension of the life of the coal-fired power stations because they realise the lights are going off without that. So yes, power prices will be cheaper than under us in the near term, as well as in the medium to longer term as well.
OK, but the Frontier report you talked about, that 44% lower cost is the cost of building it over the, between now and 2050. It didn't say anything about the price impact. You've just said prices will be lower over the medium term. Where are you getting that from?
Well, David, if you're delivering a system that's 44% cheaper, or if you look at the US modelling, what they've done in their international or in their nuclear energy agency there, they say about 37%. So it's of that order. If you're delivering a model that's 44% cheaper, that translates into cheaper power prices. Part of the reason people are paying so much for their electricity bills, we're paying 3 times at the moment for an electricity bill compared to, say, Tennessee or Ontario, where they do have nuclear firming up renewables. We can't do business. There's been a 3-fold increase in the number of manufacturing business closures over the course of the last 2.5 years. And I say 27,000 small businesses are closing. In part, that's because even though we've got an abundance of natural resource, we're paying the highest energy costs, the highest electricity costs in the world.
So how much cheaper will power prices be? This is what households want to know.
Well, again, if you apply the economics, so if there's a 44% reduction in the model of delivering an energy system, you would expect a 44% reduction or of that order being passed through in energy bill relief. Now that comes in
the next 10 years?
Not pretending that comes in tomorrow. Our first investment in nuclear, or the first plant, and as we say, we've got 2 in the flagship, which is the most efficient and effective way to deliver the rollout of nuclear. It comes in 2035 to 2037. And in the interim, we're going to have to do a lot more with gas, with coal in the system, as I say, for longer under Labor, and making sure that we don't have to overbuild as Labor is doing now, which will drive up prices over the next decade.
All right, but Frontier didn't tell you that number. You're just drawing that assumption yourself?
Well, again, David, I mean, that's the economics of it. If you're all other variables being equal, if you have a 44% reduction in the overall cost to deliver that model, that is going to translate into that price reduction for households and for businesses, and that's what we must do. We have to lower the input cost of energy in our country because we have a high wage cost compared to Malaysia or compared to the United States or our other competitor nations, and this is the one input cost that we could bring down. Instead, we're now presiding over a system where we've got blackouts and brownouts, and we're being told that that's part of our life. Well, business doesn't operate in that uncertainty, neither do ICU units at hospitals, neither does cold storage at the local butcher or supermarket, and we can't have intermittent power pretending that we can run a modern, advanced economy.
All right, look, I want to leave that energy debate because there's a few other things I want to get to. The anti-Semitism, the attacks that we've seen escalating in Australia, you've described this as a clear campaign of terror and a national crisis. Do you think the terror threat level should be increased? Well,
that's a matter for ASIO. I wrote to the Prime Minister in November of 2023 saying that we needed to have a national cabinet because the police commissioners and the police ministers needed to hear, along with the premiers and chief ministers, a very clear message from their Prime Minister that we had zero tolerance for these anti-Semitic attacks, and it was entirely predictable. We saw the protests 2 days after October 7 on the steps of the Opera House, and the Prime Minister has been weaving all over the road on this issue, and I think because of that lack of national leadership, we have seen a predictable escalation, and I worry that people are going to lose their lives, and I think the Prime Minister needs to start taking this seriously.
Have you requested a briefing with the ASIO boss about this?
I've spoken with Mike Burgess. We've had briefings from both the Federal Police and from ASIO. I find it astounding that the Prime Minister, it seems, didn't find out for 7 or 8 or 9 days after Premier Minns found out. And Premier Minns, in conversations with the Prime Minister, including a visit to the childcare centre which had been attacked, clearly was told not to raise it with the Prime Minister. It's inconceivable that in all of those conversations Premier Minns would have had with the Prime Minister, that the discussion wouldn't have come up. And if the Premier was told by the New South Wales Police not to raise it with the Prime Minister, why? I don't think there's been a true and honest account of what's happened here. But if the Prime Minister of our country is not across what was potentially the biggest terrorist attack in our country's history, essentially until the public found out about it, I think that is an absolute abrogation of his responsibility. And we do, I think, deserve to hear the answers.
Well, the Prime Minister has not said when he found out. Have you spoken to Mike Burgess since this incident, or indeed the Federal Police boss, Rhys Kershaw?
No, we've had James Patterson and our people have had briefings in relation to it. I've spoken, and I'm not going to go into the private details of text messages I've had with Mike Burgess, but I know this space very well, David, and I can't believe that the Prime Minister hasn't been informed. I can't believe... I suspect what has happened here, if I'm being honest, is that the New South Wales Police have been worried about the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office leaking the information, which is the only explanation. Otherwise, it's inexplicable that the Premier of New South Wales would have known about this planning, this likely terrorist attack with a 40-metre blast zone, and he's spoken to the Prime Minister over 9 days but never raised it, never discussed it. I mean, if he knew that the Prime Minister wasn't aware, wouldn't he have raised it with him? And I just think Premier Minns and the Prime Minister need to give an honest account of what they knew, when and why the Prime Minister wasn't briefed. It would have been the instinct of the AFP Commissioner to brief the Minister and the Prime Minister, as it was when I was Home Affairs Minister. And it's inconceivable that the Prime Minister could credibly say that he didn't know for 9 days about this.
Look, he hasn't said that, just to remind people that he's not said when.
Well,
when
why wouldn't he say when he was briefed? Premier Minns has been prepared to do so.
Look, more broadly, how would you stop these anti-Semitic attacks?
Well, there should have been from day one, David, a very clear message that we don't tolerate racism and anti-Semitic conduct, whether it's by neo-Nazi nut jobs or whether it's by the left wing of crazy organisations on campuses. For months and months and months, people were protesting against Jewish students, against Jewish academics. To this very day, the universities haven't given a proper account of how that was allowed to continue on. The Prime Minister did nothing about it. The marches on the streets that went on for months and months, waving flags of terrorist organisations, all of that allowed people to believe that there was no red line that could be crossed and there's no consequence. We've said that there should be zero tolerance, that there should be mandatory sentencing for people convicted of terrorist offences, and that I would have absolutely no tolerance, and I would convey that in the most certain terms to the AFP Commissioner and ASIO and the other agencies, to stamp it out. And the Prime Minister hasn't done that because he's seeking the votes of Green voters in inner city Sydney and Melbourne and southwestern Sydney. He's been driven by political motivation here, and I think it is a disgrace.
None of the arrests that have been made over anti-Semitic incidents in Australia so far have been visa holders. They've all been Australian citizens. What does that tell you? Is this a homegrown problem?
Well, it's a combination of things, I'm sure. As Mike Burgess would point out, a young person sitting in front of a computer screen can be indoctrinated over a week or two because of the constant videos and bombardment of propaganda. So there's obviously the influence of social media. There's the influence of people who are radicalised here in our own society. Some of them may be visa holders, they may be third-generation Australians. They may have been here for much longer or much shorter. Who knows? And no doubt ASIO will have a better picture of who some of those people are. But the point is that it is a serious issue. We went first from protests and doxing online and at universities, and then there were fire bombings, now a planned terrorist attack. And if we think it's going to stop there, we're kidding ourselves. And that's why the Prime Minister, with his first duty of responsibility to take care of Australians, has failed so dismally.
You mentioned social media, though. What about the responsibility of Elon Musk on his X platform, where a lot of this anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi stuff is thriving? Does he bear some responsibility?
Well, I've had a battle for over a decade against people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and others who are making money out of our kids. And they need to do it in a responsible way. All of us spend a lot of time online and our kids are on their devices constantly. The same rules should apply online as they do in the real world. And if there's child abuse material, which I've tried for years to get Facebook to take down, if there is that sort of explicit material, if there is terrorist-related advocacy and spreading of that hate message, they have the algorithms, they have the technology and now the AI to be able to clear it. But of course they don't, because they're driven by profit. So yes, of course it should be taken down.
A couple of things just quickly with Parliament coming back. The government's plans for tax credits for critical minerals and rare earths. Will you support that or vote against it?
No, we've been clear that, and speaking to a lot of leaders, business leaders in WA, people don't think it's going to have the impact that the government's predicting. What people are worried sick about in WA at the moment is the nature positive laws, which have been kept secret. If they were so good for WA, the Prime Minister would have had it out there and been proud, waving it around, saying this is great.
Do you welcome the fact they've been shelved?
Well, instead now, people in WA, if they're voting for Anthony Albanese at the next election, they know that they'll get nature positive laws after the election from a Albanese, Bant, Labor, Greens minority government. That would be a disaster for the WA economy and mining sector, and therefore a disaster for our national economy as well.
Will you do a deal with the government on electoral donation reform?
Well, we've been in discussion, as you know, with the government in relation to that bill. No agreement has been arrived at, but we'll conduct the discussions in good faith and we'll make any announcement in due course.
And what did you make of the announcement on Friday from the Health Minister of an inquiry into gender treatment for children and adolescents? Do you support this sort of inquiry, or do you share the concerns of Tony Abbott this is going to stop states from banning puberty blockers for the next year and a half?
Well, we welcome the inquiry. I note that we don't know yet the terms of reference. We don't know who's being appointed to conduct the review, and it's due to report back in mid-2026. So there are some caveats, and sure, the government. I'm sure the government will release that detail shortly, unless it's just a stunt. But equally, the states here have their own constitutional rights, which is why Queensland and WA, Liberal and Labor administrations have made decisions in relation to these matters, and I think their decision should stand, and the inquiry can be conducted simultaneously. But if the government's just trying to sort of cauterise an issue before the election, which I suspect is what they're trying to do, and just park it, then I think this is a more serious issue than that needs to be given proper consideration, and hopefully it will during the course of the inquiry.
So that Queensland ban on new treatments for those under 18 should still be allowed to go ahead?
Yeah, that is a decision of the state governments, right. And the state governments have a right, as the federal government does, where it has jurisdiction to make their decisions according to the basis on which they've been elected. So, and as you say, similarly for the Labor government in WA.
Opposition Leader Peter Dutton, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks for joining us on this first show of the election year.
Thanks, David. Take care.